My name's Jonathan from Campbell, California, and I have a question for you regarding the dollar price mechanism for gold. So I used to buy into the notion that silver would go to $1,000 an ounce, gold would go to the moon, and then we've seen the recent correction again, and those stories weren't entirely true. For gold and silver to go a lot higher than what they are now, wouldn't that mean that the dollar in itself would have to cease becoming the world's reserve currency? Because if there's other currencies that are to compete against it, then I think that's the only way that gold would go higher, because it's very easily manipulable when they can just create trillions and trillions of dollars of credit out of thin air. Given that they can control prices in the short term, do you think the only way for prices to go higher is if the dollar were to be replaced? And if it was replaced, would those other currencies be able to manipulate the price of silver and gold, or would it be a more level playing field and prices would go higher?
The short answer to the question the caller asks is, number one, that the price of gold does not depend on whether or not the dollar is the world reserve currency or not. That's easily provable. Look at the last 100 years and note that while the dollar was the reserve currency, gold made crazy moves up and down, and from the lows 15 years ago to the highs of 3 years ago, nearly a 700% move, and the dollar didn't collapse, and the dollar was still the reserve currency. And so you don't have to have the dollar not be the reserve currency to get a strong move in the price of precious metals. The next part of the question with respect to whether or not the dollar, if it was removed as the reserve currency and replaced with something else, would there still be the sort of, and I think the tone of the question was manipulation, would there still be price suppression maybe, or manipulation if there were other currencies used as the reserve? Well, the answer to that question is just as easy as the first part of the question, I think, which is yes, obviously. As long as central banks exist and as long as financial institutions exist that take part in that system, and as long as there's a market out there to buy and sell anything, you're going to see price moves up and down, and it doesn't matter whether or not currency A or B or Z is what's called the reserve currency. And when it comes to the price of gold or precious metals, you've got to look at everything from production to, or the lack thereof. You've got to look at interest rates, obviously. You got to look at what the purchasing power of the dollar is with respect to inflation. You have to look at supply and demand, and you have to look at a lot of things. And I think it's an interesting conversation to have about, well, what happens next if the dollar collapses, which that's really what the question's about. And the truth is, we've seen a collapse of the purchasing power in a lot of ways, not in all ways, but in a lot of ways, of 98% of the dollar in the last 100 years. When someone says, well, what happens if the dollar goes away, or what happens if no longer the reserve currency? Well, I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. I know what the doomsayers say. The doomsayers say it's the end of the economy, it's the end of the free world, it's the end of Western civilization. I don't know if that's accurate or not. I also don't know that you can make the case that it means precious metals prices will necessarily go up or they'll go down. I know a lot of people have heard stories, and a lot of people have been buying because they just can't wait for the collapse. Man, when that happens, it's all going to be over. And I have to tell you, with so many people believing that story and so many people banking on that story, no pun intended, I tend to believe that since we don't really know what would happen, I have an idea that if it was so clear and so obvious, the little guys asking the questions now and rolling the dice on which way which way the price of precious metals goes after the dollar would collapse, I'm going to put my money, no pun intended again, in the idea that if the little guy thinks he's onto it, it doesn't really usually work out for the little guy that's the story where they make their most money. So that's a longer way of saying, number one, dollar being the reserve currency, I don't think has much effect. If it did, it certainly didn't show it in the last 100 years. And number two, without the dollar, you'd still get crazy price moves up and down. And number three, even if the dollar were to collapse and go away, it might not give stackers what they're looking for in the end anyway. Thank you for watching. Hope you learned something. And now watch this and you'll find out how to send me a question or comment and see if I'll do a video on it. See ya. I know lots of y'all have questions you'd like to have me answer, and you don't want to leave a message here on YouTube. That's fine, but you still need your question answered. So I've come up with a neat way to do this. On the screen right now is a phone number, 641-715-3900. Below it is an extension, 516-387. If you call that phone number and dial that extension when you get there, you can leave a recorded message that I'll get, And all you got to do is leave your question or your comment, and I'll try to reply to your question or your comment in an upcoming video. Now, you don't need to leave any personal information, don't need phone numbers, don't need emails, and this is not a voice message box for personal stuff, but it's for questions and comments specifically about the Day Trade Show, and I want your questions. Your questions can be about money, or they can be about family or health, or all the stuff that I talk about right here on YouTube. So if you've got a question and you want me to answer it in an upcoming video, call 641-715-3900 and use the extension on the screen, 516-387. That is 516-387. And if your question's good enough, and if it makes me think hard enough, I'll get to it as quickly as I can in an upcoming video. Thank you for watching. Take care and send me those questions. I cannot wait.